So we have a few moments for questions with Lester, and the floor is open for anyone who wishes to pose a question. Lester, let me ask one question. One of the things that you mentioned that causes the pressure on agriculture is the change in eating habits of the populations as they get richer. Are there any developments that would permit an increase in meat production without the same kind of curve of use of grain? Is there any way to separate those two curves?
Well, in part, the market has actually been doing that. When we look at the grain requirements to produce meat, the rule of thumb is that producing a pound of beef in the feedlot takes about 7 pounds of grain. Producing a pound of pork takes between 3 and 4 pounds of grain. Producing a pound of poultry is about 2 pounds of grain. And if you get down to farmed catfish or carp, you can get down even to an almost 1-to-1 conversion rate there. So one of the ways of lightening pressure on the system is to eat less red meat and more white meat, in fact, less beef and more chicken, and that's what's happening. What we're seeing in the United States now is that red meat consumption is actually declining, and I think there are at least a couple reasons for that, maybe more. One is price, of course. A pound of beef costs a lot more than a pound of poultry. Two is concern about the health consequences of eating too much red meat, and so we're seeing that lead to changes in diets. The third is young people. There's a cultural shift underway, and young people today do not relate to meat in the way that our generation did. I mean, for us, if you wanted to celebrate, and go out and get a big steak was kind of the thing to do 50 years ago. It's not today. Young people are not nearly as meat-oriented. They're also not as car-oriented. There's a cultural shift underway. It's surprising how many teenagers today don't even have driver's licenses. And it's partly because for us, particularly growing up in the farming community, you wanted to socialize, you had to have something to drive to so you could meet up with other people. But today, young people are socializing over the internet. And so they don't have to physically necessarily meet. And so it's a social change that is actually leading to or reducing energy use. And the car, I think, is going to recede more and more. I think also we're going to see a shift in fuel, and I neglected to mention this, but it looks as though we're moving toward electricity as the principal source of power for cars, whether it's all electric cars or plug-in hybrids. But every automobile maker now is coming up with a hybrid version of all their principal cars. And we have plenty of electricity. It's just a matter of harnessing. And one of the ways that wind and electric cars fit together well is that the batteries in the cars become a storage facility for wind. So when the wind is blowing a lot, you can recharge your car at work or at home, wherever you're plugging in. And when it's not blowing so much, you have the battery capacity to draw on.
Question right there, please, and be sure to identify yourself.
Morning, I'm Richard Jackson. I'm at UCLA, and thank you very much, Lester, for the presentation. You've started to answer my challenge, which is last spring I decided I and folks at Health Policy International folks would teach a course on climate change and health and what do we do about it. And we had a series of meetings with graduate students where they said, look, in this course, it's okay to talk about how screwed we are for the first day. But we do not want to hear the next dozen lectures about just how bad things are. We want to talk about solutions. And you began to point at this, and as I look at these young people and how, you know, their access to information is so profoundly greater than anything we imagined. They can get more references in an hour than we could dig out of a library in a year. The way that they can connect worldwide and to each other is so profound. I actually, by the way, disagree that interacting on a computer is the way to socialize. We ought to build communities where kids and young people can actually get together in safe and healthy ways and not have to be in a car and a vehicle all the time. But I really think that those of us who are grappling with these issues have got to find the joy and find the encouragement for our young people as they're attacking the world that they are facing.
We're seeing some, I think, important new trends, and I'll just refer to two of them. One is the Sierra Club has a Beyond Coal campaign. The Sierra Club is our strongest environmental group by far. They have over a million members and the capacity to mobilize both at the local level and at the national level. And their goal is to close every coal-fired power plant in the country. And thus far, of the 492 plants that we have, they've succeeded in closing or about to close, I think it's 121 of those. But they're moving ahead. And one reason they're so successful is because we have a lot of cheap gas now, so it's easy to convert. But it's also, we're using less electricity. The efficiency of almost everything that's operated with electricity is increasing. So when you buy a new dishwasher or whatever, it's probably quite a bit more efficient than the one it's replacing. So we have this effort to close coal plants that has been remarkably successful to date. Another thing we have is we have some very successful bike sharing programs. I mean, this concept started in Europe, and Paris sort of gave it quite a bit of attention, I don't know, 5 years or so ago now. I mean, if it works in Paris, the thinking was it would probably work almost anywhere. And there are now 26 cities in the United States that have bike sharing programs. I think that 26 was the end of December, and now we have both Chicago and New York adding their cities to the list. Chicago with 4,000 bikes, New York with 10,000 bikes. But the idea, the concept of bike sharing is very much part of young people. And in the DC bike sharing program, the overwhelming percentage, I mean, way up above 90%, are the 20 to 40 age group. These are the groups that are, I mean, partly because they are younger people, but also their mindset is much more open to using bikes as their principal source of transportation. The idea of being able to grab a bike wherever you need it and drop it wherever you want is a very attractive thing. So just having bike sharing programs in the major cities in the U.S., which we will soon have, even Houston has launched a bike sharing program, and they were pretty excited about it. They realized they had absolutely no bike infrastructure. There are no bike lanes, no bike trails, no bike paths, no bike parking racks, nothing. So but it's where they're going, and the mayor is determined to make the bike an important part of the transport system in Houston. So I think a lot of the changes are going to be generational. Will be easier as we make the generational shift.
Richard, when I've met that kind of reaction, I've brought out the kind of examples, opportunities that Lester brought out, but in the end I say the big change requires you to become political. That is, personal changes, changing your personal lifestyle is an important thing, but nationally, we need a political activity in order to bring the country to a different place. At least that's been my answer. Over here, please.
Yes, my name is T. Gadotti. I'm a retired academic and
Speak right into the microphone, please.
A little louder.
Yeah. Isn't it on?
Yeah, but you have to get close to it.
Yeah. My name is T. Gadotti. I'm a retired academic and currently a consultant and journal editor. You mentioned the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal program. I think that one important aspect of their program has been to involve and to pay attention to and to show appreciation for miners' communities. And they've been very sensitive to the problem of jobs and have given that a lot of attention. And I think that that is going to serve them well as the program develops. Secondly, you mentioned biofuels generically. I think that algae may be a big exception because it doesn't compete for food and other resources. You mentioned that the trade-off in terms of sources of protein, but I think we also need to remember that there's been massive strain on ocean and marine resources due to overfishing for fish-derived content in the diet, and that's been a serious problem. So it's really a displaced problem as opposed to a solved problem. And then finally, how do you approach the usual criticism of wind power, which is that if you build a wind power generating capacity, you have to duplicate it because wind is not a reliable source of energy?
Let me take the last question first. Do you remember how we did it with nuclear power? Because when you have an accident in a nuclear plant, you just close it down quickly and you lose a big chunk of your electricity with no warning. The difference is with wind, we can forecast wind with some confidence, at least 24 hours into the future. But what happens, and there's a good study at Stanford on this where they've sort of modeled the U.S. wind economy, and what they've discovered is that as wind farms grow larger and as we move toward a national grid, then wind becomes baseload, because the wind's always blowing somewhere. We have onshore breezes, we have winds in the Great Plains, we have wind in the mountains, et cetera. So there's always wind, so it's not as much of a problem as you would think. And I would point out that 3 of the states in North Germany now get between 40 and 50% of their electricity from wind. And I don't think there have been any breakdowns or power outages because of that. They've got it pretty well worked out, and they're probably going to go higher. The creation of a national grid is actually underway. I don't know if you followed it, but recently we've, as you probably know, there are basically 3 grids in this country. The eastern grid that goes from the East Coast to the Rocky Mountains. There's a West Coast grid that comes down through California and also into Arizona and New Mexico. And there's a Texas grid. Those are the 3 grids. They are now being interconnected in Clovis, New Mexico, northeastern New Mexico. Clovis is where the Clovis arrowheads were and spearheads were found. But that will, it's not massive lines that have been linked, but the linkage has been made. And now the question is developing HC DC lines that are very efficient in moving electricity long distances. And so the stage is set in this country now for a national grid, given this connection. It's just a matter of building the links, and there are a lot of private investors who are now building lines as investments. I would cite one that goes from southern Kansas into the southeastern United States. The southeastern United States is one area that it is not well endowed with wind resources. And there are investors in Texas now investing in wind farms that are going to supply wind to the southeast. Other investors in the western part of the states developing wind farms that'll be selling to California, for example. So we're beginning to see a national approach to the management of wind resources falling into place. And FERC, of course, is actively supporting this effort. Now, you asked about algae. We've been hearing about algae for some time. Algae, of course, depend on photosynthesis, and so you have the same photosynthetic limits with algae that you have with other more efficient plants. But it does take water, and it does take area. So I'm not sure we're going to see algae playing a major role as sources of either fuel or food or feed in the future. I could be wrong. I know ExxonMobil's been working on this for a decade now, and they still don't have anything that approaches a meaningful commercial use of the technology.
Lester, we're going to have to cut this off, I am afraid. Can you ask a question very quickly and shortly?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jack Spangler, Harvard. I was going to ask your observations on two things, but I'll leave it to one then. You made this point of urgency, an 80% reduction of greenhouse gases in 8 years. What's your observation? Do you see any likelihood that we should be optimistic that we could set a goal, nation or the world, to achieve that aggressive plan?
Not yet. The question is, how many summers like last summer in the U.S. Midwest, the Corn Belt, the Great Plains, will it take before we begin to take the climate thing seriously? And I mention that because it directly affects the food supply. Most people don't understand the difference between 350 parts of CO2 per million in the atmosphere and 400 million parts per million. They do, however, understand food prices, and that, I think, is going to be the driver of changes in energy policy, and it could come much faster than we think. Sometimes social change comes because of a particular event. Pearl Harbor is the classic example of an event changing everything overnight. Sometimes it's pressure gradually building until change comes, until there's a revolution, or the Berlin Wall coming down is an example of that, for example. So I don't know what combination of events it will take for us to reach a tipping point. But I do know that societies do reach tipping points, and once they do, by definition, things change very rapidly.
Thank you, Lester. Just to put this, Lester's challenge of 80% reduction by 2020 in context, at the Copenhagen conference in 2009, I think it was 9, maybe 10, President Obama put a 17% reduction from 2005 to 2020 on the table. And right now, I think the conventional wisdom is that that is doable if, but only if, the EPA adopts regulations regarding emissions from existing coal-fired power plants, existing ones. They have regulations for new ones. So, and I think that's plausible. I think that's plausible, but that gets you to 17%, which is, as Lester says, totally inadequate by any stretch, except at the moment what looks like political feasible. Thank you, Lester, very much for your comments and for putting food and fuel as competing claims into context.